When I was 19, my parents laughed at me for burning dinner. My mom said, "You can't even boil water right." That night, I cried in the kitchen, swearing I'd never cook again. But 3 years later, that same dish made the mayor stop mid-bite. And what he said on live TV made my parents go completely silent. I never thought a single dinner could change everything. But looking back now, I realize that humiliation has a strange way of either breaking you completely or forging you into someone you never knew you could become. My story isn't just about cooking. It's about finally understanding that the approval I desperately craved from the people who were supposed to love me unconditionally was never going to come, at least not in the way I needed it to. It started on a Tuesday evening. Nothing special, nothing out of the ordinary. My parents had invited a few family friends over for what they called a casual dinner, though with my mother, nothing was ever truly casual. Everything had to be perfect, measured, controlled. I had been living back at home for about 6 months after a rough breakup left me emotionally drained and financially struggling, and during that time, I'd found solace in the one place I never expected, the kitchen. Cooking had always been my mother's domain, her throne room where she reigned with absolute authority. She was the type of cook who measured everything to the exact gram, who followed recipes like sacred texts, who believed there was only one right way to do anything. Growing up, I was never allowed to help beyond setting the table or washing dishes. "You'll just make a mess," she'd say, shooing me away with a dismissive wave of her hand. But during those 6 months back home, something shifted inside me. Maybe it was the late nights when I couldn't sleep, or the desperate need to feel like I could create something beautiful after my life had felt so utterly destroyed. I started experimenting in the kitchen when my parents were out, teaching myself through YouTube videos and food blogs, making mistakes and learning from them. There was something deeply therapeutic about taking raw ingredients and transforming them into something nourishing, something real. I discovered I had a natural instinct for flavors, for understanding how ingredients spoke to each other. Where my mother relied on rigid recipes, I learned to trust my senses, the smell of garlic just beginning to turn golden, the exact moment when herbs released their oils, the way a sauce would coat the back of a spoon when it reached the perfect consistency. Cooking became my meditation, my therapy, my quiet rebellion. So when my mother mentioned this dinner party, something bold and probably foolish stirred inside me. I offered to make one dish, just one. A braised short rib with a red wine reduction, served over creamy polenta with roasted root vegetables. It was a recipe I'd been perfecting for weeks, adding my own touches, a hint of orange zest in the braise, fresh thyme from a little pot I kept on my windowsill, a splash of balsamic at the very end to brighten everything up. My mother looked at me like I'd suggested burning the house down. "You want to cook? For guests?" Her voice dripped with skepticism. My father, reading his newspaper at the kitchen table, didn't even look up, but I saw the corners of his mouth turn down in that familiar expression of doubt. "I've been practicing," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, confident. "I really think you'll like it," she sighed, that long-suffering sigh I knew so well.
"Fine.
But I'm making a backup dish, just in case." The word stung, but I pushed the feeling down. I would prove myself. I had to. The day of the dinner, I woke up early. I went to the farmer's market and selected everything myself. The most beautiful carrots still wearing their dirt like badges of honor, parsnips that were sweet and firm, short ribs with perfect marbling. I came home and started my prep work, moving through the kitchen with a focus I'd never felt before. This wasn't just about making a meal. This was about showing them, showing myself, that I was capable of something extraordinary. As the afternoon wore on and the house filled with the rich, deep aromas of my cooking, I felt a flutter of hope. My mother walked through the kitchen several times, peering into my pots with a critical eye, but saying nothing. My father came down once, sniffed the air, and said, "Smells different," before retreating back to his office. Not exactly encouraging, but not outright dismissive either. The guests arrived at 7. The Hendersons from down the street, my parents' college friends the Matsons, and my Aunt Linda, with her new boyfriend, whose name I immediately forgot. Everyone gathered in the dining room, and I carefully plated each dish in the kitchen, my hands trembling slightly as I arranged everything just so. The meat had fallen off the bone perfectly, the polenta was silky and smooth, the vegetables were caramelized to a deep golden brown. It looked like something from a restaurant, and for a moment, I felt a surge of pride so intense it almost brought tears to my eyes. I brought the plates out one by one, setting them before each guest. There were polite murmurs, the kind of sounds people make when they're reserving judgment. I sat down in the only empty chair, my heart pounding so hard I was sure everyone could hear it. My mother took the first bite. I watched her face, searching for any sign of approval, any flicker of pride. She chewed slowly, deliberately, her expression unreadable. Then she set down her fork and reached for her water glass. "It's interesting," she said, her voice carefully neutral in that way that meant she hated it. "A bit too experimental for my taste. The orange zest is overwhelming." My father cut a piece of meat, examined it, then looked at my mother. "Did you make your chicken as a backup?" he asked, not even bothering to lower his voice. The table went quiet. I felt my face flush hot with shame. Mrs. Henderson cleared her throat awkwardly. Mr. Matson took a bite and made a non-committal humming sound. "I think it's quite good," Aunt Linda offered weakly, but even she didn't sound convinced. My mother stood up, smoothing her napkin. "I'll get the chicken." I knew I should have just done all the cooking myself. You know what they say, too many cooks spoil the broth. She laughed, and a few others joined in with uncomfortable chuckles. I sat there, frozen, as my mother brought out her perfectly roasted chicken with her butter, and I watched as everyone's faces lit up with genuine appreciation. They practically pushed my short ribs to the side, serving themselves generous portions of her dish instead. The conversation resumed, flowing around me like I wasn't even there, and I heard my father say, "This is why we stick with the classics. Some people just don't have the instinct for it." I excused myself before dessert, mumbling something about not feeling well. In my room, I stood at the window and looked out at the darkening street, my throat tight with unshed tears. I'd worked so hard. I'd put everything I had into that dish. And they dismissed it without a second thought, replaced it like it was garbage. But as I stood there, something else began to burn inside me. Not just hurt, anger. Real, hot, clarifying anger. Who were they to decide I couldn't cook? My mother, who'd never encouraged me to try anything, who'd kept me out of the kitchen my entire childhood. My father, who'd barely tasted the food before asking for something else. The guests who'd been too polite or too cowardly to give me an honest chance. I pulled out my phone and started scrolling, not really knowing what I was looking for. And then I saw it, an advertisement for the annual Riverside Culinary Festival, happening in 3 weeks. It was a community event where local home cooks could enter dishes to be judged by a panel that included the mayor, a food critic from the regional newspaper, and a chef from one of the city's best restaurants. The winners would be featured on the local news station and in the paper. My finger hovered over the registration link. This was insane. I'd been cooking seriously for less than a year. I had no formal training, no culinary school credentials, no restaurant experience. Just months of trial and error in my parents' kitchen while they were out. But I clicked the link anyway. I filled out the form. I paid the small entry fee with the last bit of money I had in my checking account. And when I hit submit, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Determination. I didn't tell anyone what I was doing. Not my parents, not my friends, not even Aunt Linda, who'd try to defend my cooking. This was going to be mine, win or lose. For the next 3 weeks, I became obsessed. I refined my recipe, testing it again and again. I adjusted the orange zest. Maybe my mother had been right that it was too much, so I pulled it back, made it more subtle. I experimented with different cooking times, different temperatures, different finishing touches. I snuck out to the kitchen late at night when my parents were asleep, working by the dim light of the range hood. I took notes in a journal, documenting everything, what worked, what didn't, why certain combinations sang while others fell flat. I tasted and adjusted, until I could make the dish perfectly with my eyes closed. My mother noticed I was spending more time in the kitchen but assumed I was just making simple meals for myself. She'd occasionally make pointed comments. "Don't use all the good olive oil," or make sure you clean up properly this time. But she never asked what I was working on. My father barely registered my presence at all, buried as always in his work and his newspaper. The isolation stung, but it also fueled me. Every dismissive comment, every time they ordered takeout instead of eating what I'd prepared, every skeptical glance, I stored it all away, let it feed the fire growing inside me. The day of the festival arrived on a bright Saturday morning. I told my parents I was going to help a friend move, packed my ingredients and cooking equipment into borrowed containers, and took the bus downtown to Riverside Park. My hands were shaking as I set up my station among dozens of other home cooks, all of us arranged under white tents along the river. The energy was electric. People were everywhere, contestants preparing their dishes, volunteers rushing around, early visitors starting to wander through with sampling tickets. A small stage had been set up at one end of the park with a banner that read Riverside Culinary Festival, 15th Annual, and I could see camera crews setting up equipment. I tried not to think about the fact that this was being televised on the local access channel. I tried not to think about anything except the food. I had 3 hours to prepare my dish, and then the judging would begin. As I worked, I fell into the rhythm I'd practiced so many times. The short ribs went into the Dutch oven with the wine, stock, and aromatics. The polenta started on a gentle simmer. The root vegetables were tossed with olive oil and herbs. My hands moved with confidence now, with muscle memory, with purpose. Around me, other cooks were creating their own magic. I could smell garlic and ginger from one station, fresh baked bread from another, something sweet and caramelized that made my mouth water. We were all strangers, all competitors, but there was a kind of camaraderie too. We'd nod at each other, offer a spare ingredient if someone ran short, share the nervous excitement of people who'd chosen to be vulnerable in public. As the judging time approached, I plated my dish with shaking hands. It looked beautiful. The meat glistened, the polenta was perfectly smooth, the vegetables were arranged just so. But would it be enough? Would anyone taste what I'd poured into it, not just the ingredients, but the hope, the defiance, the desperate need to prove I was worth something? The judges began making their rounds. I watched them stop at station after station, tasting, making notes, conferring quietly among themselves. And then they were at my station. The mayor, Mayor Patricia Chun, who I'd seen on the news but never in person, Marcus Rivera, the food critic whose reviews could make or break a restaurant, and Chef Jean-Paul Beaumont, whose French bistro was the nicest place I'd ever eaten. I explained my dish in a voice that barely trembled. Braised short ribs with red wine reduction, creamy polenta, and roasted root vegetables with herbs. They each took a bite. Time seemed to stop. I watched Mayor Chen's expression change as she chewed, watched her close her eyes for just a moment. Chef Beaumont cut another piece of meat, examining how it fell apart, how the sauce clung to it. Marcus Rivera made a note on his clipboard. And then Mayor Chen smiled. Really smiled. Not the polite politician smile I'd seen on TV, but something genuine. This is exceptional. The depth of flavor here, the way the orange zest plays with the wine. Who taught you to cook? My throat was so tight, I could barely speak. I taught myself. Well, you have a real gift, she said, and I watched as she took another bite, clearly not just being polite. Chef Beaumont nodded in agreement, saying something in French to Marcus Rivera, who was writing more notes. They moved on to the next station, but I stood there, dizzy, hardly daring to believe what had just happened. Mayor Chen had liked my food. Really liked it. The same dish my parents had dismissed had literally replaced with chicken. The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur. I cleaned my station, packed up my equipment, and wandered through the festival in a daze. Other contestants congratulated each other, families sampled dishes, children ran through the park with faces sticky from desserts. I sat on a bench by the river and just breathed, letting myself feel the validation that had been so long in coming. The award ceremony was scheduled for 4 o'clock, right as the festival hit its peak attendance. By the time I made my way to the audience area in front of the stage, hundreds of people had gathered. I stood near the back, not wanting to get my hopes up too high. There were categories for different types of dishes, appetizers, mains, desserts, people's choice. I'd entered the main course category, which had been one of the most competitive. Mayor Chen took the stage, and I noticed the local news cameras were rolling, broadcasting live. She spoke about the importance of community, about how food brings people together, about supporting local talent. Then she started announcing winners. Third place in my category went to a woman who'd made an incredible paella. Second place went to a man with a complex lamb dish that had smelled amazing. And then Mayor Chen paused, smiled at the crowd, and said, "Our first place winner in the main course category created something that truly stood out. The technique was flawless, but more than that, you could taste the heart in every bite. This is someone who understands that cooking isn't just about following recipes, it's about telling a story, about putting love on a plate." She looked down at her card. My heart was pounding so hard I felt dizzy. First place goes to the braised short ribs with red wine reduction, creamy polenta, and roasted root vegetables, prepared by. She smiled even wider. This is special, folks. This cook is completely self-taught, learned everything from scratch in less than a year. Please welcome to the stage. And she said my name. I stood there, frozen. People around me were looking, searching for who'd won. Someone near me said, "That's you. Go," and gave me a gentle push. My legs somehow carried me forward through the crowd, up the steps to the stage. The lights were blinding. I could see cameras pointed at me, could see Mayor Chen's warm smile, could hear applause, but it sounded distant underwater. She handed me a trophy, an actual trophy, and a check for $500. But more than that, she pulled me into a hug and whispered, "Don't ever stop cooking. You have something rare." Then she turned me to face the cameras and said, "Tell us, what inspired you to enter today?" The microphone was in front of my face. I could have said so many things. I could have told the truth about the dinner party, about my parents' dismissal, about cooking in secret. But instead, what came out was simpler, more honest. I wanted to prove to myself that I could create something worth sharing, that my voice mattered, even if it's expressed through food. The crowd applauded again, and as I walked off the stage clutching my trophy, I felt something shift inside me. It wasn't about my parents anymore. It wasn't about proving them wrong. It was about proving myself right, that I had value, that I had talent, that I deserved to take up space in the world. I took the bus home as the sun was setting, the trophy on my lap, still not quite believing it had happened. I turned off my phone during the competition, and when I turned it back on, it exploded with notifications. Text messages, missed calls, voicemails. My heart sank as I scrolled through them. "My Aunt Linda. Oh my God, I just saw you on TV. I'm so proud." Friends I hadn't heard from in months. "You won a cooking competition? That's amazing." And then I saw them. 3 messages from my mother, sent about 20 minutes apart. First message, "We saw you on the news." Second message, "Your father and I watched the whole thing." Third message, "We're proud of you. Can we talk when you get home?" I stared at those words, "We're proud of you," and felt absolutely nothing. No joy, no relief, no satisfaction. Just a hollow emptiness where those words should have landed. Where were they when I needed to hear it? When I'd served them my heart on a plate, and they'd literally replaced it with chicken. I didn't respond. I put my phone back in my pocket and watched the city roll past through the bus window. Part of me had fantasized about this moment, about rubbing my success in their faces, about seeing them realize they'd been wrong. But now that it was here, I just felt tired. Tired of seeking their approval, tired of making myself small to fit into their expectations, tired of believing that their opinion of me mattered more than my opinion of myself. When I got home, both my parents were waiting in the living room. The TV was on, paused on a frame from the news broadcast, me on stage, holding the trophy, Mayor Chen's hand on my shoulder. My mother stood up as soon as I walked in, and I saw something in her face I'd never seen before. Not quite shame, but close. Discomfort. Uncertainty. "We had no idea you'd gotten so good," she said. "That dish you made for dinner, the one with the short ribs, was that the same one you made today?" "Yes," I said simply. My father cleared his throat. The mayor seemed very impressed. And that chef, the French one, they interviewed him after, and he said your technique was restaurant quality. He said it like he was trying to convince himself, like he needed external validation to believe what he should have tasted himself. I know, I said. I was there. An awkward silence filled the room. My mother twisted her hands together, a nervous gesture I'd inherited from her. I think maybe we were too harsh at dinner. Maybe we didn't give your cooking a fair chance. It's just that I've always been the cook in this family, and I suppose I felt threatened. I offered. The word hung in the air. She flinched but didn't deny it. Perhaps. That's not an excuse, but perhaps that's what it was. I set my trophy down on the coffee table between us. In the pause, I could hear the clock ticking on the wall, the hum of the refrigerator from the kitchen. Do you know what the hardest part was? I asked quietly. It wasn't that you didn't like the food. It was that you didn't even try. You decided before you tasted it that it wouldn't be good enough because I made it. Because in your mind, I'm still the kid who wasn't allowed in the kitchen, who couldn't possibly know what she's doing. My mother's eyes filled with tears. You're right. And I'm sorry.
I'm so sorry.
My father nodded. We should have supported you. We should have encouraged you instead of mocking me. I finished.
Yeah.
You should have. The thing about finally being seen is that it forces everyone to recalibrate. Over the next few weeks, things shifted in small ways. My mother asked me for cooking advice. My father bragged about me to his golf buddies. Aunt Linda shared the news clip on Facebook so many times I had to ask her to stop. I got calls from a few local restaurants asking if I'd be interested in staging in their kitchens, learning from their chefs. But the biggest change was internal. I realized I didn't need their validation anymore because I'd found something more valuable, my own. Every time I cooked now, it wasn't to prove anything to anyone. It was because cooking made me feel alive, made me feel capable, made me feel like I was exactly where I was supposed to be. I used the prize money to enroll in a weekend culinary course at the community college. I started a small Instagram account sharing my cooking journey, and people actually followed it, asked questions, tried my recipes. I began catering small dinner parties for friends, then friends of friends. Word spread. My calendar filled up. 3 months after the festival, I moved out of my parents' house and into a tiny studio apartment with a kitchen that was barely bigger than a closet. But it was mine. Every pot, every pan, every knife was exactly where I wanted it. I cooked whenever I wanted, whatever I wanted, experimenting and failing and succeeding without anyone looking over my shoulder with judgment. My parents and I have dinner together now, sometimes. The relationship isn't perfect. I don't know if it ever will be, but it's more honest. My mother still gives me unsolicited advice sometimes, old habits dying hard, but she also asks genuine questions about my techniques, my inspirations. My father tells me when something needs more salt, but he also tells me when something is exceptional, and I can hear in his voice that he means it. Last week, I catered a small birthday party. As I was cleaning up, the host pulled me aside and said, "That was the best meal I've ever had in my home. You can taste the love in every bite." And in that moment, I thought about Mayerchen saying almost the exact same thing, about how far I'd come from that terrible dinner party where my food was pushed aside. I used to cook to earn my parents' love, to finally be good enough, to prove I deserved a seat at their table. Now I cook because somewhere along the way, I fell in love with myself. Not in an arrogant way, but in the deep, quiet way you love something precious that you've almost lost. I cook because my hands know how to create comfort, because my instincts guide me toward beauty, because when I'm standing at a stove with a wooden spoon in my hand, I'm exactly who I'm meant to be. The trophy from the Riverside Culinary Festival sits on a shelf in my apartment. I see it every day, but it's not the trophy that matters. It's what it represents. The moment I stopped waiting for permission to be proud of myself. The moment I realized that the only approval I truly needed was my own. The moment I understood that being dismissed by the people who should have celebrated me said everything about them and nothing about my worth. To anyone reading this who's ever been told they're not good enough, that their dreams are silly, that they should stick to what they know, I'm telling you what I wish someone had told me sooner. They're wrong. Sometimes the people closest to us can't see our potential because they're too invested in seeing us as we were, not as we're becoming. And that's okay. Let them have their small vision. You go be extraordinary, anyway. I'm not a famous chef. I don't have a restaurant or a cookbook deal or a cooking show. But I have something better. I have the pure, uncomplicated joy of doing something I love, doing it well, and knowing in my bones that I earned every bit of it. No one gave it to me. No one can take it away. If this story touched your heart, I need you to do something for me. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. That friend who's afraid to pursue their passion. That family member who's been told they're not talented enough. That person sitting alone right now wondering if they'll ever be enough. Hit that like button if you believe that our worth isn't determined by people who can't see our value. Subscribe and turn on notifications because I share stories like this every week. Real people, real struggles, real triumphs. Stories about ordinary people who refuse to stay small. Drop a comment and tell me, what's the one thing you've been afraid to try because someone told you that you couldn't? I read every single comment, and I promise you, your story matters. Share this video with someone who needs to remember that they don't need permission to be amazing.
Tag them right now.
Send them this link. Sometimes one story can change everything. Remember, the people who dismiss you are just revealing their own limitations. Your potential is limitless. Your voice matters. Your gifts are real. Don't wait for applause to start living the life you deserve. I'll see you in the next story. Until then, keep proving them wrong by proving yourself right.